Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summit.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Rob Neyer, author of Powerball, Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yes, one of our favorite people to have on, our official baseball correspondent, Rob Neyer, is on. And how cool is this? We've also got multi-time best-selling author Jim DeFelice co-hosting with us. Jim's book is out. It's also called West Like Lightning. So we've got two fresh books. You can pre-order Powerball right now. By the time the show comes out, the book should be pending about a week away. But it's Rob Neyer. You know we love it. Jim and I, turns out, both have loved Rob since the 90s.
I am a Rob Neyer fanboy. I mean, by the time this podcast comes out, hopefully his book is number one on every bestseller list all across the nation. And anybody that thinks they know anything about baseball should pick it up and see how the game is played and not played in some respects these days. Pick it up. It's a primer. I would even throw it at non-baseball fans. Get some of them involved.
Well, the people I really want to reach are the baseball fans who are not immersed in the game, perhaps the way we typically are. I think that when we're immersed, we tend to think that all the other fans are like us, right? Hitting the websites and every day reading fan graphs and baseball prospectus and watching Brian Kenny religiously and sort of the full immersion. And it's easy to think that they're all like us, but there are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of baseball fans who aren't quite that immersed. And really, that's who I wrote the book for. I think they will be surprised and intrigued, I hope, by a great deal of what's in this book, because there are things that you don't necessarily get if you go to one or two games during the season and just turn on the TV to see how your favorite team is doing a few times a week. There are most baseball fans fall into that category. I think they will be interested to know, for example, why don't players bunt more? You hear that question all the time. Well, I have a couple of answers in here. Yeah,
you talked about that. You talked about the velocity of the ball coming in is only been faster since, it's just gotten faster. 95 miles an hour, you said at one point in the book, it's notable, but it's on the bottom end of fast. So when you go to bunt, there's less time to figure that out, and there's a lot of other cost to bunting. The numbers, it's hard to make it make sense. How did you sort through? I want to talk about the structure of the book in a little bit and have you and Jim kind of compare and contrast. But when it came to picking out your sidebars, because you have sidebars for your sidebars as well, like there's
and notes for his notes for his notes.
Yeah. But it's all relevant to the conversation, and it's just a fantastic model. So how did you sort through what you wanted to highlight and what didn't quite make the cut?
Well, I'll answer the second part first because it's in my head right now. Has been in my head a lot. I left out an essay, or I think the problem with it wasn't fully formed, but I wrote something about the modern state of managing. Why managers get fired so often, even when they win, what a manager's job has become. And I think I touch on that a little bit in the book, but really not much at all. And I really don't know why it wound up getting left out. I think it's one of those things where someone once said that you never finish a book, you abandon it. And at some point you just have to say, you know what, that's enough. I've got a deadline. I want these things to be in, and there's not going to be room for this other thing, even though I would like that to be in as well. It's funny, speaking of which, I literally had a dream last night about the book. And I think basically I've been having a lot of anxiety dreams in recent weeks because the book's coming out. And in my dream last night, I was in a conversation with someone and basically wound up admitting that my chapter on on infield shifting was too long. And I think that if that had been,
what does your conscious mind say, though?
No, I think. I don't know. I think it probably could have been a little shorter, and that might have left room for the manager's subject. And I actually did cut it down some, but there were some subjects. That was one of them. There were a couple of others where they were even longer before my editor said, you know what, you could probably cut some of this, and I did. But I was fortunate. And I'm getting off the beam a little bit here, but I was fortunate because my editor basically let me write the book that I wanted to write, or at least the book that I did write. And he had suggestions, and I paid attention to all of them, maybe not quite as much as he would have liked, but I wanted to write about infield shifting. So I went on for 4 or 5 pages about it. And maybe that was a page or two too long. I don't know. But so the managers, I wish I could have gotten into the book, or I probably should have gotten into the book. As far as how I chose the subjects, I think that it really was just about, first I made a list of all the things that I thought epitomized modern baseball, modern Major League Baseball anyway. And I tried to focus especially on the things that have changed over the last 30, 35 years. Then it was a matter of taking that list of things that I thought were necessary to write about and then find a game that allowed me to write about those things. And so we first was the list, then was the game, and there was a process involved in finding the game that I found sort of illuminating. But once we'd identified the game, then I watched the game multiple times and just then it was a matter of sort of outlining, okay, I want to write about this. Where does that slot into this game? When is it most relevant? So infield shifting, well, of course, there were a number of infield shifts, and there were different times when I could have written about it, but I chose one and got into it there.
Let's just to back up for people who obviously haven't read the book yet. The format, what happens is basically you're watching a baseball game. Rob picks a baseball game, takes us there. He's sitting next to us. We didn't even have to buy him a beer, but we did buy the book. And, and he talks to us. He's kind of, he's the best color and analysis, and the statistician and everything else going on while we're watching this game. So it's not like, I think some people may get the wrong idea. Oh, it's a collection of essays or anything. No, he's kind of strung everything together like you're actually, you're at a game. And I was curious about how you chose that specific game, actually, because it wasn't a playoff game. It wasn't, in the span of 162 games. It may not have made the top, 10 list of either of those teams. Maybe not, certainly not the top 5, I would think. Why did you choose that particular game?
We had a couple of options, I think. One was to choose a game that was essentially meaningless, which is to say it doesn't matter who wins at the end.
No baseball game is like that. Come on.
I mean, one point that I could have made in the book and didn't, except at the very end, was that even though the game is, quote, meaningless, unquote, it's meaningful if you're a fan of one of those teams. I don't care what time. I haven't been that sort of fan in a while, but I well remember what it's like to care about every single game. I don't care if your team is, it's the last day of the season and your team's in last place. If you're a fan of that team, or at least when I was a fan, that sort of fan, I cared about every game. So you're right. There is no meaningless game. I think for the readers, there are meaningless games, especially when they happen in a previous season. So we sort of had a choice between a game like that or a game. You could point to one of the ALCS games last year, Astros and Yankees, or one of the World Series games.
Sure.
And those epitomized the modern game pretty well. Tons of strikeouts, tons of relief pitchers, tons of power. And the reason we didn't choose one of those games, frankly, or one of the reasons, is that I wanted to get started working on the book before the World Series. So we chose this game in September. The idea was, and I mentioned that it was illuminating. I thought naively that all I had to do was make a list of the things I wanted to see in a game, and then that game would sort of magically appear with a little bit of research. Well, it turns out that baseball games, just like life, just as in life, you'll never find the perfect situation. You'll never find the perfect car for you, or the perfect mate, or the perfect anything. Really, there are always going to be trade-offs. And in our game, for example, there wound up not being many strikeouts, which is especially odd. Well, for the A's anyway, because they struck out a ton, but there weren't that many strikeouts. Of course, all you need is one strikeout to write about strikeouts, so that was not a real problem for me. It would have been nice if there were 20 strikeouts, and I could have gone into depth with that as an illustrative element. But we wound up with this game because it was a couple of really interesting teams. The Astros, because they epitomize modern analysis, probably more than any team, even the Cubs or the Red Sox or any of the others. And the A's, of course, because of the Moneyball legacy. So my editor came to me with a list of, after I sort of threw up my hands when I was trying to analytically or systematically find the perfect game, he came to me and said, look, I found these 5 games. I think these would all work. You want to pick one. And so I just looked at them and I thought, oh, this game would be fun. And then I watched it and agreed that it would work. Just went from there.
So you have a file of every baseball game ever played? Is that how that works?
No, it's funny. I did not. I toyed around with trying to figure out a way to statistically study every game from last season.
Really?
And,
Wow.
and then that didn't really work, so I narrowed it down some. And I still could never, by using baseballreference.com's play index, I thought I could I wanted to find a game with, home runs greater than or equal to X, strikeouts greater than or equal to X, and relief pitchers greater than, et cetera. And I just couldn't quite make it work. So that's when I gave up, and I was willing to keep trying, but then my editor said, you know what, let's not bother with that. Let's just, here's 5 games, pick one. So I did.
But had you done that though, then that what those high school math teachers were telling you about how, math would still be practical, have a practical use in life. You would have just had a quadratic equation that could have figured out which game to go with.
Yep. And I could have put that in in a footnote, or maybe a postscript. Okay, here's the ultimate baseball game equation, but I didn't get it done. Not in time.
That'll be the next book, I guess.
Right.
In the structure of the book, though, you do use win probability percentage as a way to kind of keep time as you go chapter by chapter. Did you use, a healthy bit of, dynamic, the game twists and turns? Did you look for that specifically with the win probability part, since you were going to use that as a clock, as a meter?
Well, I appreciate that you mentioned that, because that was actually an element of my editor's list of games. Eric Nelson is my editor's name, by the way, at HarperCollins. He used that as well. He wanted a game that had ups and downs. We used Fangraphs, win probability, and they have literally have a graph for every single game, and you can see the graph go up and down. Obviously, the more ups and downs you have in the graph, the more dramatic basically the game was. And so I included those percentages at the end of each chapter, just so people would get a sense for how those things can change. And the idea is that it takes you back into when you get to the end of the chapter, you see the score, you see the win probability percentage, and it reminds you that, we're watching a baseball game, and with all these twists and turns. I think that the danger in writing the book the way that I wrote it, and I can't say that I solved the problem particularly well, but you never want to forget that you're actually in the middle of a game. And I would write 3, 4, 5-page sections about this topic or that topic, and you can lose the narrative thread of the actual game. I never quite figured out a way to insert that thread in every few paragraphs or every page. So I hope that people don't lose the thread. It probably is inevitable a few points in the book that people say, wait a second, what's the score again?
That happens when you're actually at a game, though.
Right.
or listening to the game on the radio. It's like,
especially if you're having a conversation with somebody, which is, as you suggested in the beginning, that the idea is that we're talking about a game. Obviously, it's a one-sided conversation, but I think that for better or worse, one thing that has perhaps the only thing that's typified my writing style since I got started decades ago was that I have a conversational style of writing. I don't wear that as a badge of honor. I wish I could be a little more poetic and lyrical at times, but that's just not the writer that I've ever been, and maybe I never will be.
So there's a definite parallel between Westlake Lightning and Powerball, and I wanted to get into that. And I know Jim and I, we discussed this a little bit, but you guys both use this common storytelling thread. And also, Rob, you may not realize this, but even though you wrote the book, you mentioned the Pony Express in your book. So there's this great cosmic alignment. Jim, let's talk a little bit to Rob about the structure that you guys chose and the similarities.
Well, everybody knows that baseball was invented in 1860 when the Pony Express was started, and these guys were playing baseball on their off days. And no, hopefully everybody knows that's a joke. What I was looking for was some sort of narrative structure to hold it together and hopefully write in a conversational style, which I take as a badge of honor, actually, Rob, and I think that's that you should too. And it just so happened that geography was something that helped me stretch everything together. And Rob's is more, has the structure of the game that he's following and doing. I'm not sure how many other I'm off the top of my head. As far as a full book goes, I can't remember anybody else kind of using an entire game to do that. And I may be wrong. I may just not have read enough baseball books. But I really like that about Rob's book. As I said earlier, it really is like, you have this really knowledgeable, personable fan sitting next to you. And, he even, he's going to order a couple of beers and maybe some hot dogs for you. And, while you're talking about the game and, kind of for me, it held everything together. And I have to confess that the win probability stuff, I totally worked in the book. It totally works, keeping you together and keeping things together. But, I will out myself as a Yankee fan. Even if my team is down 8 runs in the, bottom of the 8th, I'm still optimistic that we're coming back, or I want to be optimistic. 8 runs might be a bit much. I want to be optimistic. That's the one statistic that I don't want to look at that statistic. I may know it, deep in my soul or whatever, that it's unlikely, but I'm thinking, man, I'm staying here for this game because this is going to be the greatest damn comeback ever.
And Jim, I wrote the same thing in the book basically. I mean, I don't think that it's a particularly useful metric for people actually watching or listening or for those broadcasting the game. It's in my mind, it's got very little utility. In fact, aside from, it's useful if you're doing what I was doing, which is a very small subset of writers or fans. And I think it's useful. It's been described as the best story stat, which I can understand after the game, but I don't want to hear about it during a game. Absolutely not. You're right. When you're watching the game or listening, you want to think that anything can happen. And of course, the truth is anything can happen. But if someone actually puts a number on it and says, well, now we have a 3.2% chance of winning, is that do I think, ooh, 3.2%, I better keep watching? Or do we think, I think I'll just go ahead and turn this off? It depends on the sort of fan you are, obviously, but I don't think it has much place with during a game. After, sure. After the fact, show me the graph, show me the ups and downs. But during the game, no, a lot of the percentages aren't that useful. And that's sort of the modern broadcaster's biggest challenge is to sort through all these numbers that are available and figure out what makes sense. And there are, frankly, not many broadcasters are very good at that. Boog Sciambi at ESPN, he is great at knowing which numbers make sense within the context of the game. I think a lot of it is generational. and that the broadcasters who grew up with these numbers or who grow up with them, they're going to be doing games over the next 30, 40, 50 years, and they'll get it. They will be able to sort of weave all these new numbers into the storyline of the game in an elegant way and help people enjoy the game and stay in the game as opposed to being taken out of the game.
Well, for some of our listeners who aren't, really deep into the, stats or whatever, what, just kind of briefly, could you tell us what, what stats we should be paying attention to now? And I know that's actually a big part of the book, but, maybe get people into it.
In a very fundamental way, the same stats are important now that have always been important. They're just, in many ways, there are more of them now. Controlling the strike zone has always been an important part of baseball. The best pitchers in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and et cetera, for the most part, they controlled the strike zone. It wasn't with a lot of strikeouts, with a few exceptions. It was with generally not many walks. But that's typically how you won. There were very few pitchers, successful pitchers, who didn't control the strike zone. There were a few, but very few. And the same thing was true with the best hitters. You look at Ted Williams being the best example, of course, but
sure.
Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays, et cetera, et cetera. For the most part, they controlled the strike zone. They hit home runs. They didn't strike out a ton. Mickey Mantle did for his time, but not compared to players today. And they walked a lot because they got good pitches to hit. And all that's still true. It's just that the ratios have changed because, of course, the strikeout rates are so high. There was not that long ago, if you averaged a strikeout per inning as a pitcher,
Great.
You were among the league leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And now that's nothing. Now the league leaders are in the 11, 12, 13 strikeouts per 9 innings range. So that has changed, but basically you still have to control the strike zone. You just have to do more of it, as a pitcher anyway. The numbers that you're hearing people talk about now that you didn't before, more than anything, is launch angle for hitters, because that's now measured and it's available to every broadcaster basically. And it's just something they can throw into the broadcast. Most fans, I think most broadcasters aren't quite sure exactly what it means. A lot of these numbers, and I write about this in the book quite a bit, a lot of the new numbers, they're not really that useful for fans. Even ones who dig in, they're useful for players and coaches who are trying to get better. But if you tell a player, you know what, you can hit 5 more home runs this season if you increase your launch angle from 12.3%, your average launch angle, to 15.8. That's doable. Well, he can put together a plan and make that happen, or at least give it a good shot. If you tell a fan that this guy increases launch angle from 12.7 to 15.8, what do you do with that? Not a lot.
But you
there are
can
dramatic.
translate it.
Pardon me?
But you can translate it into, to say Ted Williams,
Yes.
the way Ted Williams swung, and
That's right.
that sort of thing.
And that's exactly right. If your story is that he's now hitting like Ted Williams hit, that's interesting. That's exactly right. And I think we're at the beginning of that process of broadcasters and writers to contextualizing these new numbers. But they're measuring everything now. We know exactly how fast every player is, what they call his sprint speed. And that's interesting. I just read the other day, there was a pitcher, now I can't remember which one, maybe it was Lorenzen, that he is like a second and a half, his speed his number of feet per second, sprint speed, is 1.5 feet faster than the average major leaguer, which is incredibly fast for a pitcher. That's interesting. That's really interesting. But what I've found is that all these new numbers, they're interesting only when the numbers are contextualized and at the extremes. So you show me the fastest pitcher and how fast he is. That's interesting to me. If you show me that this guy is the 18th fastest pitcher, not interesting. Doesn't matter. We have the ability to do that precisely, but where's the utility in that number? I don't really see it as a fan or even as a writer. As an analyst, if you're working for a team, sure, all these numbers are useful. You want everything. Teams want everything they can get. They're collecting data like people couldn't even have imagined 10, 15 years ago. But the great majority of those numbers, of that data, just isn't all that useful if you're outside baseball.
I was the other day on Fangraphs, I was reading an article by Andrew Dominigiani, and he was talking about bouncing a throw versus throwing it in, chest high, and what was the better way to do it. And this kind of goes to your ability to understand how to coach up a player, like what is better. Do you do the Tony Fernandez low throw, skip it in? And that begets the questions like, your risk of airmailing a ball is higher if it's up higher. And also, like, if they've got to jump, now they've got to look up and then come down and then find the runner. So all of these things are being studied, and it's interesting. Another part of that, what he talked about, was using that burst speed and determining, what the difference in time of that ball arriving, a thousandth of a second sooner equals 18 inches or whatever that distance is. And so you start to get a contextual, clear picture of, his ability to cover those last 18 inches is kind of split between his burst speed and the outfielder's ability to get the ball to the right spot. Another thing that's interesting in all of this stuff is like a stat like barrels, or weak contact, which is kind of the antithesis of it. And, does a pitcher create fewer barrels, or are they better at creating weak contact? And how do you differentiate between that? And then what about a player that lives on weak contact? Someone like, like Brett Butler comes to mind, where everybody would just draw in towards the infield because he never made hard contact, but he was able to make a living making soft contact. What do you think about all that stuff? Not really a question, Rob, but when all these things are coming out, I guess maybe my question is a guy like Joe Davis, who took over from Vin, he's comfortable with this stuff. He reads Fangraphs, he reads the local blogs and has respect for him, whereas some of the older guys out there, Hawk Harrelson comes to mind, where he just refuses to accept any kind of number thing, and he's nearly done. But as we start to get more people that are comfortable talking about these numbers and creating the context, your book is in front of all that. You've done this conversation now. You've almost like captured what would happen in the booth 10 years from now.
Well, I hope so. I think that again, generally speaking, a broadcast is far more interesting and educational than it was 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. At the same time, we've also lost something. I think that you can listen to a broadcast. I listen to a lot of games on the radio on my phone. I don't really get to watch anything on TV anymore because of having a kid, but I listen on the radio. A lot of radio broadcasts, flipping around to whatever the closest game is between two contenders. That's the one I'm going to listen to. And there is a certain sameness to the broadcasts, at least among the younger broadcasters, because they're all professionals. They aren't as colorful as they used to be, so we have lost something, but they're also smarter than they used to be. So we've gained something. On balance, I think I prefer the modern broadcasts, but that isn't to say, again, that we haven't lost some color as well. So I still have a great appreciation for Hawk Harrelson, for Bob Uecker, for John Miller, who's a little younger than those guys, but Miller certainly has a great deal of color. I think there's room for a lot of different sorts of voices. I don't really appreciate a broadcaster simply dismissing the modern game or the modern analytics, which Harrelson has done. Obviously, he's famously TW baby, the will to win. But I'd still enjoy him, perhaps because he is a throwback.
I think the best guys are kind of like storytellers in a way.
Yes.
And they're also. And I have to admit, especially living in the New York radio market, that they're mostly homers, but that's who their audience is, and they're telling you a story. It just happens to be a story that's unfolding, and there has to be a balance between the information you're getting and the color and everything else that that comes along with that.
Yeah, and I think, frankly, most crews do a pretty good job. When I've tried to put together rankings for my own, not just in my head, there are a lot of good ones. There are only a few teams, broadcast teams, that I can't listen to. Most of those are on the TV for whatever reason. In the Yankees situation, I find their radio broadcasts utterly unlistenable. I have not listened to more than 5 seconds of a Yankees broadcast in years. That said, I love their TV broadcasts. I think Michael Kay is tremendous at what he does, and I think nearly all of the analysts in the booth with him are also outstanding. I've never understood the disconnect between their TV broadcasts and their radio broadcasts. And
well, there's a pretty strong disconnect.
I know there are people who love Sterling, and
Sterling's a lot of fun,
but I can't
only take him in. I love Sterling when the Yankees are winning. Leave it at that. But you're right, and the Yankees announcers and the others, the other teams I've listened to, there is usually one guy, at least one person, that's trying to integrate a lot of the the statistics with, but also with the old stories. When I pitched, I couldn't, I had to pitch a certain way and blah blah blah, and that's interesting too. Yeah,
it is, and in fact, I was really disappointed when the ESPN dropped Joe Morgan and John Miller, because even though Morgan is anti-sabermetrics, even though he was a great sabermetric player, as an analyst, he disparaged it every chance he got. And Miller was certainly not a numbers guy. I liked them because Miller is a great storyteller, and Morgan had a lot of great stories from playing, so I enjoyed them. And I even enjoyed the next team. I think that Dan Schulman, who was
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
I even enjoyed the next team. I think that Dan Schulman, who was the play-by-play man, is a tremendous professional and got the numbers. And then you had Schilling and Kruk, neither of whom talked about the numbers, and who just told stories and joked around. But I enjoyed that team as well. So there are a lot of ways for me to be entertaining and educational at the same time in the booth. I'm not locked into, this guy has to say this and this guy has to be this sort of broadcaster and there's no room for this. I think there are a lot of ways to do it. There are a number of teams, broadcast teams for me, that still don't meet that standard, but I can enjoy it. It's just like baseball generally. There are a lot of different ways to enjoy baseball. And when somebody says, oh, you don't you just like the numbers. Well, you know what? There's nothing wrong with liking the numbers. I like the numbers. I like to go to the ballpark and everything in between.
Yeah, you think about a team like Pat Hughes and Ron Santo. They're never worried about the numbers. There's a lot of there's a lot of homerism, and I think Pat can do whatever. He's a pro. But because you've got someone like Ron who's such a character, and they're talking about his wigs and all that kind of stuff, it's just you don't have to rely on something like barrels, or burst speed or feet per second, because Ron Santo's going to talk about mowing the yard in his gamer toupee instead of his number 2, and that's just hilarious.
That's right, and I have to acknowledge that it would be I'm not sure what the word is. Condescending probably isn't the word, but I should mention that a lot of this is about one's personal taste, because I've liked a lot of broadcasters who did not understand the numbers or use them correctly, but they seem like someone I would like to hang out with. So if you find Susan Waldman compelling personality-wise, by all means, enjoy her personality. I just don't particularly, or Sterling, so I can't listen to those two work together. But there is a great deal of subjectivity involved when you're talking about broadcasters, and I try to be cognizant of that when I talk about them.
There were a lot of, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but there were a lot of like really cool things that Rob brings up in the course of the game that are not necessarily discussions that you would think about or points you would think about it when you go to the game. For instance, there was a great, and maybe this is because maybe I'm or not maybe I'm height challenged, but you bring out Rob. Obviously, Altuve is a great example, but talking about the role of height, in terms of baseball players and scouts, and have statistics. I mean, has that helped people who don't have quote unquote a baseball body, or is it because I'm short that I'm kind of hoping that more short players will?
No, I really believe that, and that's one of the misconceptions about the numbers. The idea that there's an idea out there, and it has been for a long time, that the numbers depersonalize the game, and there is an argument to be made for that. On some level, yes, that does happen. But at the same time, the numbers, in a way, open up the game for different sorts of people. They democratize the game in a way. Because if you believe, as people did in baseball for many years, that you have to be 6 feet tall or 6'2" to hit home runs and play third base, well, guess what? You've just created this essentially little mini society, or this culture, where it doesn't matter how good you actually are. All that matters is what the numbers say about you, the numbers in this case being your height. And I talk about this in the book some. I really think that players who aren't big are getting more chances now because the numbers have educated people to the point where they realize, oh, guess what? There are a lot of guys who are 5'8", 5'9", or in Altuve's case, 5'5" or 5'6",
right,
really can play at this level, just as they always have been able to. I don't even talk about him in the book, but I mentioned him briefly because he barely plays in the game, but maybe he doesn't play in the game. Alex Bregman, who is one of the very best players in the American League this year, he's only 5'8" or 5'9". So the Astros, because they are looking at the numbers, they're looking at performance rather than how tall a guy is. And they've got numbers saying, you know what, we've got a history here. Look at Joe Morgan. There's no shortage of players in baseball history who were smaller than average, but who were tremendous players. Willie Mays was not a large man. Hank Aaron wasn't a large man. So why all of a sudden do we think you have to be 6'2" to play baseball? It never really made any sense, but it took teams to sort of say, you know what, we love our scouts, but our scouts might be focusing too much on this physical attribute as opposed to how well he actually plays baseball. And I go into this, and I mentioned things I probably should have written less about. I probably should have written a little less about David Eckstein in the book, but David Eckstein couldn't get a break in the minor leagues because he was 5'8". He wound up being an all-star and a World Series MVP. And Jose Altuve was never considered a great prospect in the minor leagues, even though his performance was certainly well deserving of that status. He couldn't even be named one of the top 10 prospects in the Astros organization. And when you see the list in the book of the players who were ahead of him on those lists, you'll be dumbfounded. How could they miss on this guy?
Yeah.
And the reason is because he was 5'6".
You spent a lot of time talking about that theme in general, and there is something when you bring in the statistical analysis part of it where you're trying to figure out who the next player is. But baseball, unlike the other sports, you have the ability to figure it out. Even if it's just for a year or two, you learn that, I don't know, the proper launch angle swing. You completely retool your swing, or something changes in your makeup as a player, and it's very hard to divine that. And someone like Altuve, who had good numbers, but had to overcome the stigma of being short. But there's other players, like anybody could have had Justin Turner on their team. Anybody, but the Dodgers, for whatever reason, signed him as a backup utility player, and turned out he's an MVP caliber, maybe not MVP winning, but MVP caliber player when he's around and healthy. It's interesting that the speculative problem with baseball, where 25th round players can still make their major leagues, that's always been a problem, and we haven't necessarily. Have we gotten better at figuring that out? Have the numbers helped us see it better?
Nobody will tell me if teams have gotten better when it comes to at least judging minor league, I should say amateur talent.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing, my guess is that they have gotten better, but just barely. The Astros are run by Jeff Luhnow, of course, and he got his start in baseball with the Cardinals. And it's been written, I think accurately, that while Luhnow was running the Cardinals draft, they produced more major league talent than anybody else did. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that he and his team were better at evaluating amateur players than most of the other teams, maybe all the other teams. A lot of that is predicated on one draft. I think it was the 2009 draft. I could be wrong, but they produced like 6 or 7 guys who in one draft, including some big time late rounders who were big contributors when they won the World Series a few years later. But they also had some drafts that didn't work out that well. Nobody's figured it out. And the Astros have drafted some players who didn't, with high draft picks, who didn't work out at all since Luhnow's been there. So nobody's figured out the secret to the draft or signing 16-year-olds from the Dominican Republic or Venezuela. What you're trying to do is be 5% better, 10% better than the other teams. And I think the Astros have done that. Their minor league, and this isn't just evaluation, this is also training, but their minor league teams have tremendous winning percentages over the last 5 or 6 years. Every year they're at the top or very near the top. And their minor league teams are consistently in the playoffs. So they're doing something different. It's hard to say exactly what, because of course they don't tell everybody what they're doing. But if you look at the success, and this is one thing you can actually measure, if you look at the success of first round draft picks 1 through 30 over the last, say, 5 years, is it going to be that much better than it was 20 or 30 years ago? And the answer is no. A little better? Probably, but not much better. It's still largely hit and miss. Once you get past that first pick in the draft, and certainly after the first 5 or 10, guess what? That 18th pick, the guy that people think is basically the 18th best player in all of America coming out of college or high school, the odds are against him ever being a good major league player. So that's how hard it is. It's been that hard since 1965 when the draft began, and it's still that hard. It's not quite as hard as it used to be because teams are smarter now and they have more numbers to look at, especially the college players, but it's still incredibly hard to put a number on an 18-year-old or even a 21-year-old baseball player.
Yeah, and one of the points that you make in the book, you talk specifically about how long it takes most players to go from being drafted to actually getting up to the major leagues rather. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on. So maybe they were great when they were 16, or they looked like they would be great when they were 16, but the development system, the minor league system, a lot of it's not just choosing a great player in the draft, like let's say, happens in the NBA. You actually have to know how to develop the player, and maybe you have to be lucky.
Absolutely. There's a lot of luck involved, no question. And I mentioned that draft that the Cardinals had when Luhnow was still there, and all the players who wound up helping them win. Of course, they did a great job in identifying these players, but I spoke to various people who had been with the Cardinals then, and scouts. And this is not for my book. This is an earlier project, but they were lucky to get some of those guys. They were lucky they did as well as they did. They were lucky they were still available when they drafted. So absolutely it takes luck, no question. And there's also that long process. Not only do you have to find the guy in the first place, whether it's drafting him or signing him, then he's got to stay healthy, mentally, emotionally, physically, as he's moving up that ladder. And it is one thing that distinguishes baseball utterly from almost every other sport that I know about is the timeline. Yes, occasionally you'll have a player, Bryce Harper being one example, a few others, who are essentially ready to play in the major leagues when they're 18, 19, 20 years old. There used to be more of them. There are very few now, although there's been a bit of a surge just in the last 2 or 3 years, which is pretty interesting. But for the most part, that timeline has always been a long one. I don't care if you sign the kid when he's 16 in the Dominican Republic, or whether you draft him out of college when he's 21 or 22. He's probably, even if he does make it and become a good major league player, it probably won't happen until he's 23 or 24 years old, oftentimes even later. And if you think about basketball or football, there are lots of players who are ready to play in the NBA when they're 20, 21. Lots of players ready to play in the NFL when they're 20 or 21, running backs in particular, the speed positions. So it's just a different sort of game where you can't simply show up because you have the physical talents, the raw physical talents, and immediately be able to contribute at the highest level in the world in your sport. With very few exceptions, baseball simply isn't that sort of a game, which is what distinguishes it from all the others.
It seems like, too, baseball, of the big three sports, it has the ability to identify a specific weakness that everybody in the room can see. You know, like whatever, this person's got to prove he can hit an inside fastball, and everybody's going to continue to throw that thing until you can adjust to it and prove them wrong. Whereas football, yeah, maybe a coach notices that you flex your knee too much as you hit the line, and that makes you vulnerable. But there's also a lot of immediate help around that person. So, like, okay, we know this guy gets too low or too whatever it is. Let's make sure we're covering this. When you're at the plate, there's no covering it. If you can't hit an inside fastball, if you can't control the strike zone from the other side of the on the rubber, it's going to be really apparent, and it's going to be obvious even to fans at home. You know, you can see when a pitcher gets tired, like when their curveball stays high and they're not getting down on it. You can see that and say that guy's worn out, and next thing you know, the balls start coming and the hits start flying. So it does seem that baseball is more in that turn. Like, it's just harder to hide your flaws, maybe.
Well, I think that was especially true before the information age, actually, because not to say that scouting reports were perfect, they weren't, but there is a long, long history of teams scouting players, because of course baseball is more of an individual sport than most of the others, team sports, obviously. So you would have advanced scouts. There are stories of advanced scouts going back many decades, especially before the World Series or something, trying to figure out what a player's weaknesses were. I think those reports were often terribly inaccurate because your sample sizes were just too small, but it was being done. And that only became more true in the 70s and 80s when teams had more resources for things like advanced scouts. And that's happening today with data and in granular detail, no question. But the other sports have caught up. It isn't just now that in basketball and football, for example, and I can't speak to hockey, but I suspect it's roughly the same. It isn't just that you scout the other team's schemes and their play calling. Now in football and basketball, they actually scout individual players. You know, in basketball, for example, I know for some years, teams have been looking at individual players and with incredibly specific numbers on where they make shots and where they miss shots. And if you're the defense, you try to push him away from the places where he makes shots. So that's all happening now. One of the untold stories, I think, is the level of analysis that has been brought to the other sports. And there have been some books about soccer and football and basketball, but not like baseball, where every year now there's one or two books that drill into detail on what's happening in baseball analytics. For whatever reason, even though the numbers are there in football and basketball, with few exceptions, we just don't hear as much about them as we do in baseball. And that's always been true.
Are there analytics or statistics maybe that you think, right now they're just on the cusp of being accepted, popularly, but the casual fan doesn't know about, but maybe should be paying attention to or expecting to happen over the next couple of years? Or
it's hard to predict what people will find accessible. One of the things that's really interesting that's happening now for pitchers is something called, well, a couple of things actually. And I barely mentioned the first of these in the book, just in passing. I don't mention the other at all because I just didn't really have the space or the knowledge to get into it. But pitchers, and I hope I mentioned this, for the most part, the pitchers are way ahead of the hitters in terms of their fundamental ability to transfer all the new data into performance. We know about launch angle. Hitters are able to use that, and that's helpful for a lot of them. But that isn't the only thing, but it's among the very few things that they can really do in terms of modern analytics. The pitcher is one that has the ball. So they are initiating the action. Ultimately, yes, they can change their swings a bit, but the hitters are reacting to what the pitchers do, and that makes it tough to apply analysis. The pitchers, and now I'm way off the track, but the first thing that I was going to mention was pitchers are focusing in a very analytical way now on what's called tunneling, which is simply the idea that you want your pitches, let's say you throw 3 pitches, you want them to look as much as possible like one another until the last possible microsecond. Mm-hmm. And they've never really focused on this before because they didn't have the numbers. They knew it was a good idea, of course, but now they can change their deliveries, change their pitches a little bit. So to optimize that idea of tunneling. So the slider looks exactly like the fastball until the last possible second. The other thing they're doing now is called pitch shaping, which again, it's not a new concept, but they're able to, using special super slow motion cameras that they all or almost all of them have access to now, they can see exactly where every pitcher grips the baseball, for example, and they can see how he moves his fingers and his wrist while he's throwing the baseball, all this in incredible detail. So it now becomes possible, or at least theoretically possible, to say, let's see, I really like Trevor Bauer's changeup. I'm going to try to do the same thing. And I'm not just going to ask him how he does it. I'm not just going to study some grainy film. I'm actually going to see exactly where he puts his fingers on the ball, exactly what he does with them, exactly how his body, et cetera, et cetera. So you've now got pitchers deciding that, my changeup isn't good enough. I want my changeup to be like this guy's, and I can see exactly how he does it. Is that going to work for everybody? No, of course not. You're never going to have exactly the same pitch. You're never going to be able to throw Greg Maddox's cut fastball exactly the way he threw it, but can you come pretty close? Well, maybe. And that's only going to become more true in the coming years as the cameras get even better, as pitchers and coaches develop even better training and practice techniques. So it's really one of the things that I talk about in the book, especially at the end, is that the pitchers are in the process of taking over the game. And I think that ultimately something has to be done to keep the pitchers from doing that, or you wind up with too many 1-0 games, too many strikeouts, more than people want to see anyway.
Well, that begs the question: what do you think's going to be done, or what should be done, or to keep pitchers from taking over?
Well, my first answer is simply they need to first acknowledge that there's an issue, and to this point, a great number of baseball people haven't been willing to say that, because they don't believe it's an issue or because they just don't want to say it out loud. I don't know, but the notion that somehow 1968 style baseball is something people want to watch, I don't think not many people really believe that who have studied the issue. It's hard to say that publicly because, first of all, you don't want to sound like you're running down the current game, and I don't want to do that either. I enjoy modern baseball. I do. I just don't think it's ideal. And you also don't want to create conflicts where you don't need them to be. If you start saying out loud, pitchers are carrying too much of the load right now, well, you've now upset half the union, basically. That's not a good idea either. So, but at some point, you've got to acknowledge that that there are better ways of doing things. There is a more entertaining game that could be had. Once you acknowledge that, then I think you start running some studies. you start doing some experiments. You run some theoretical studies. You run some experiments in the minor leagues, in the Atlantic League, an independent league with pretty good players. You try to figure out what would work. I have some ideas, but I haven't done the experiments. I think, yes, you could lower the pitcher's mound by an inch or two, and you could bring a little more hitting to the game. I think you could move the strike zone up an inch or two, take something away from the hitters as well, maybe incentivize or de-incentivize uppercut swings. What I think you want ultimately, you want a game with more balls in play. You want a game where Ozzie Smith can exist again, because right now Ozzie Smith would not be Ozzie Smith. If you brought 20-year-old Ozzie Smith back to the majors, he would be he would be the best shortstop in baseball, but he wouldn't be a superstar for the simple reason that he wouldn't make as many plays as he used to make.
Right.
That's one thing that I think people don't understand, is that even if you think strikeouts are exciting, with every strikeout you gain, you lose the potential, at least, for someone to make a great play in the field, whether it's Ozzie Smith or Gary Maddox or Willie Wilson, whoever it might be. You've just lost something. And I think that the balance that exists now between strikeouts and batted balls, and in turn, interesting things happening in the field, I think it's out of whack.
Yeah, that finding what whack is definitely a tough thing.
Well, that's another subject entirely, Pete.
Yes.
But speaking about pitchers, on the other hand, and again, another one of those little gems that kind of pops in unexpectedly while you're, when you come to the game, and yet when you're reading Rob's book, it's totally natural. You spend a good deal of time talking about, how pitchers, or possibly the need to protect pitchers now. Is that a practical thing that's going to happen?
Well, pitchers, I think, are being protected. We know that teams are trying to protect them. It's not clear that the injury rates are going down much. The last I saw, professionally speaking, in professional baseball, the injury rate has not gone down overall, at least the elbow injury rate. And the reason, maybe this is simplistic or maybe it's simple, I'm not sure, but even as they ask them to throw fewer innings, they are asking them to, or they're being expected to throw harder.
Yeah.
And create more stress. I don't care, even if you're throwing fewer innings and fewer pitches, if you're now throwing 102 instead of 92, that's creating stress, more stress, a higher workload, or at least the same workload. They're being asked to work harder than they've ever been asked to work in terms of how hard they throw, not how often they throw, but how hard they throw. And I don't really see any way around this. You'll still see people occasionally say, well, they shouldn't throw as hard. Well, where in baseball is someone going to actually suggest that? They're successful because they throw hard.
Right.
And if you ask a team, would you rather this guy threw 80 innings at 92 or 60 at 98? They're going to take the 98 every time, because that guy throwing 98 is almost certainly going to be a more effective pitcher. And you can always find another guy when that first guy gets hurt or when he's not available. Arms, and especially relief arms, have become fungible, with 150 some pitchers this year throwing 95 plus, and with real roles, not guys who came up for an inning, but guys who actually were in a bullpen for or starting for a significant chunk of the season. There seems to be a limitless supply of guys who can throw 95. And when this one gets hurt, well, hey, look, there's another one in AAA who will bring up. So there's no obvious reason to think pitchers are going to stop throwing. Pitchers are not going to keep throwing harder and harder. There is a limit, I guess, 104, 105 probably, but more and more pitchers are going to approach that limit, and they're going to keep getting hurt.
No, for sure. Like, I have a rule of thumb when I look at pitchers. Like, remember Zumaya throwing 103 miles an hour, Matt Alexander throwing 100 plus. Nobody does that for long. Yeah, Aroldis Chapman continues to do it, but there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. But anybody who's Kyle Farnsworth could approach and exceed 100 miles an hour, but only so many times, and then the body just starts to break down. The other thing that I've noticed, too, is and I know the Dodgers would do this, they carry a lot of players. They have an extraordinarily deep roster and almost have a roster plus because they'll proactively disable somebody like there's a tight muscle. And instead of saying weak people aren't allowed on the mound, they're like, hey, you're getting hurt. Get off the mound, and we don't want to have 80% of you. We want to have you healthy. So go do 10 days. And so they're trying to find ways to, one, manage the roster size that you need to pitch the way they do now, but two, also not throw someone out there in ignorance and say, yeah, your elbow hurts. Let's go get you a platelet treatment on your elbow ligament, which we all know never works. That's within 3 months that platelet treatment has failed, and the ulnar collateral ligament has given up. So some teams are learning more and being more creative with how they do it, and less stubborn with using the disabled list in a proactive way.
Well, I think that's true, but they're also disabling guys who aren't actually hurt.
Well, yeah, there's that,
and are at no real risk of being hurt badly. They want pitchers to be at 95 or 100% because they're going to pitch better at that level. Yeah. They don't want the guy at 90%, even though he might not get hurt, he won't be as effective. In 1984, the Royals used 13 pitchers the entire season, and now teams use 25 or 30 pitchers in a season. If you go back and look at the pitchers the Royals used, it isn't as if all those guys got the next year because they pitched so much. It wasn't that at all. They pitched differently. They had a pitcher named Joe Beckwith who threw 101 innings and was pretty effective. They had a pitcher named Mark Huseman who threw 75 and was decent. Did they have better guys than that in AAA? I don't know. Probably not. But they also the thinking then was, this guy's okay. He doesn't seem hurt, so let's just keep him around. Now, if you have a guy who's just okay and he pitches 2 games in a row, you're thinking, well, he might not be very good in a third game in a row, so we'll disable him and bring up a guy from AAA who's fresh. Really, it's all about having fresh arms.
Or you send him back to AAA.
What's that? Say it again.
Right. Some teams like the Yankees will shuffle. They shuffle a lot of their
absolutely. They basically have 10-man bullpens or 12-man bullpens because
absolutely.
Those first the 4 or 5 or 6 best arms in AAA are essentially on the major league roster. There was one of the pitchers in the book, Danny Coulomb. I believe he told me he was sent down or up and down 5 or 6 times one season with the Dodgers and pitched and was on the major league roster for the grand total of, I believe, 10 days. So the roster limits are essentially pointless at this era.
The Dodgers are masters of that. They'll take
they are the acknowledged masters of it. Yes, they sort of figured it out before anybody else did, and now other teams are doing it, but they figured it out first.
So they go this far. Like they'll take someone who's a Rookie of the Year candidate, send them quote unquote down to AA. They have to stay down for say 10 days, knowing that they're going to disable somebody else they won't need in the following series, and so that person will get injured, quote unquote injured, for 10 days, and then we have an injury, so we're going to bring this player we demoted back up. They're never actually demoted. It's just a roster management tool. And yeah, you said, Rob, they run a 60-man roster instead of a 40 easily. It's what they do.
On the other hand,
right. And I'm not convinced that it's good for baseball, but everybody within baseball likes it that way. They like playing around with roster spots, and the players love it. So a lot of them, because I mean, you are creating so many more major leaguers, and let's be frank. Even if you only get 1 inning in the majors, you carry that for the rest of your life. So the players are all for all the roster manipulation. I think for most of them are, especially the pitchers. So there's no obvious reason why this would ever stop. But I think as a fan, it's impossible to know all the players. It used to be you could know literally every player in major leagues. You could know their names. You could know who they played for. You can't do that anymore. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or good thing, but it's just different.
Jim, do you got one more question for Rob?
Well, actually, I I think maybe I heard wrong, but Rob, you recently have kind of another gig outside of writing that relates to baseball. You've kind of gone over to the other side. Is that,
I have this season? I still am the commissioner of the West Coast League, which is sort of the Pacific Northwest equivalent of the famous Cape Cod League, summer collegiate league with wood bats. So yes, that definitely was the other side for me. Is the other side for me, and has been tremendously educational. Someone who's always been an outsider, all of a sudden on this level, I'm an insider, and it's fascinating to see what happens within the game.
Do you like being on the inside now? Or is it limiting, or what?
Well, I think it would be limiting if I were trying to write about this level, but because it's so far divorced from Major League Baseball, it doesn't feel limiting. It's not something that I ever thought I would do or was able to prepare for. I just sort of jumped in, and all of a sudden I'm writing, making rulings on suspensions and trying to, there's this line from a movie called, I think it's called Heist. I might be wrong, with Gene Hackman. And someone asked him how he figured out what to do or what his MO was. And he said, I'm not that smart. I just think I try to figure out what a smart person would do and then do that. And that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to, many times over the course of my first season, I would think, okay, what would a commissioner do here? And then that's what I would try to do. And I can't say that I nailed it every time, but I have become, at least some of the time, a decent imposter, I think.
Well, let me just say, first off, thank you for writing Powerball. That was a fantastic book. Thank you, Jim, for coming on and hanging out with us and co-hosting. I want to let everybody know to buy Rob's book, Powerball. He's Commissioner Rob Neyer. And seriously, I love having you on because we always have these fascinating chats. And heck, we went long today, and I don't even care because it's just, to me, it's interesting. And I love how deep and just wonderfully sticky the knowledge that you have in your head is, at least for my taste. I loved the book. I loved the side notes. I loved the notes to the side notes. I loved all of it. It was fantastic. Thank you so much for writing. So you guys got to support Rob's book. Make sure when you buy it on Amazon that you put 5 stars and put a review in there, because that helps other people find the book. And it really is. If you're a baseball person at all, I promise you're going to love it. I promise you're going to love it. So definitely buy the book. And again, thank you, Jim. And thank you, Rob.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
Jim, Pete, this was great. I appreciate the time, and I always enjoy our talks.